Hello everyone, question and answer video today from two comments that I received on the Goths and the Capetians. They're good examples of the kind of questions that of course I'm pleased to receive, especially from a historical point of view, because I hardly get any question in the first place, and even less frequently on the actual, say, not much the content per se, as we will see from here, but just legitimate historical curiosities, and they are two significantly different topics, so I'm going to answer them also in different ways to the best of my knowledge. All right, I start from the Gothic one. This was asked under the video about Austro-Gothic Italy. I never explicitate the name of the author of the question, but it's a public comment. In any case, it's the phrase that matters. Are you familiar enough with the writings of James Harrington and his views of the Gothic Constitution to comment on them? So the simple answer is no, I'm not familiar enough with his work in general, meaning that I have never studied it. So I know actually what he wrote, who he was, but I'm not sure I can provide with the best insight on his work, because he's a very nuisance character, right? This is just to make you understand here, essentially a republicanist, but also a monarchist in different ways. He was very close to Charles I, so he lived through all the mess of the English Civil War, and he was a very also mentally challenged individual. Like, we don't know exactly what the deal was, but he had to prove not to be mad at some point. He suffered of depression, which at the time was seen as, of course, as a weakness rather than else, and his work is actually quite impressive for the scope and depth of topics dealt with in it. And this one about the Gothic Constitution is definitely one, if not one of probably his most famous one, right? And it basically, just to make the long story short, to the best of my knowledge, it refers to the ideal existence, naturally in this time of juridical and institutional debate regarding essentially the prerogative of the monarchy and the one of the people, so the context is crucial. Looked at a generic, say, past of Europe from a legal point of view, tracing essentially back to the Gothic people, intended a bit like the Germanic one as a whole, and or at least one that was particularly, let's say, incisive in during the migration era. Both because of their juridical production, but the fact also that the Goths were the ones that, especially at the time, resounded as having sort of taken down Rome, which technically is not true, but that, of course, in the 17th century resonated dramatically in a country torn by civil war, when you would see crypto, Catholics or open Catholics and so-called Papists, right, and from the other side, definitely a different view of tradition, of religion, and in this sense having the monarchy and the people also in the same struggle. And Harrington is not the obvious republicanist in the sense, okay, let's cut the head to the king, also because his depression, if I understand correctly, was triggered also by the fact that he had been close to the monarch. And when Charles I was killed, this, say, deeply struck Harrington's worldview and just life for many also practical reasons. But again, I don't have even the time to simply digress on it. But I can gather more information if you're interested in this topic, right? And the idea behind the sort of this idealized Gothic Constitution is the existence of a sort of original idea about a sort of balanced form of power, which a monarchy, right, a constitutional monarchy fundamentally would be mitigated, in fact, by the covenant with the people, in a way that the Goths would have allegedly, say, brought on the fore historically. Right? And again, this position is very nuanced because, as you understand, it's not an anti-monarchic concept per se. It's not even a fully Republican and or democratic one. It's something that in which Harrington definitely shows his awareness of some juridical dynamics of the ancient and the medieval Europe, in that, however, and I have to interpret also the reason of the question here, because it's not simply like talk about Harrington Gothic Constitution. What is it that you're looking at? This was asked, in fact, under the video again on Ostrogothic Italy, the 6th century. So if the connection here is between 17th century England, Britain as a whole, and 6th century Gothic kingdoms, of course, I see where this is coming from and where this is going, right? Just even by the wish of the author of this question, and I can answer in the following way. So first of all, Harrington is not just historically aware of the fact that there were different changes in ancient and medieval juridical balance, right? He had, for example, an understanding that the Roman constitution was initially more sort of egalitarian. I will cite to be quite concise on it, but you understand there are huge topics, and that by late antiquity this had turned into something more autocratic. And so the Gothic constitution would enter basically the Roman world, coming to dominate in parts of the same, and so to some extent being, say, a carrier of a broader Germanic sort of order that the Goths would have embodied the most. And I think here, again, I will stress it till the end. I don't know enough Harrington's work, say, to the historical, say, to the depth of his historical understanding of this older times, right? But it is obvious that he picked the Goths because these were, at the time, actually the first Germanic people to develop not just a political territorial state within the Roman Empire, because essentially this was created by the Romans as such. The Germans didn't have this outside of it, and I will explain it further later. And it was a monarchic state of some sort. And I think this is quite crucial because, of course, the Anglo-Saxons, first of all, at the time were just, establishing their domains in Britain, but of course would take some centuries before developing a monarchy of the English on their own. And Harrington is also aware, by the way, of the fact that there were different stages throughout, because he starts from that sort of migration era background, and he starts analyzing eventually just or at least he concentrates mainly on the juridical history of England. So he takes into consideration the Anglo-Saxons, the Normans, just all the various issues that had occurred during the Angevins, the Magna Carta. So, and getting to the Tudors, that I think he accused of being fundamentally against. Also, like there was a sort of back and forth into the adherence to that sort of ideal principle that he would have of sort of institutional, juridical, political mitigation that the Gothic Constitution here should have been ideally. So I don't think that he forces his hand substantially on, say, there is a Gothic Constitution that exists still today in the 17th century and we should be applying it. The Gothic Constitution is just a sort of mark that can be, a sort of pattern can be identified on the basis of what the Goths would have allegedly established back in the day. And I don't think that he literally believes that the Goths had even a sort of, fil rouge historically with the various, say, in their specificity of Gothic monarchs. and people to modern era, in fact, monarchies, right? I think he identified only one, say, country that had something similar to that fundamentally in his own time. He was praising Venice, for example, that he considered, that in the Protestant world, the Venetians, despite being Catholics, were quite praised because they were not allowing the Inquisition to operate on their territory. In the Renaissance, this was a big deal because in Venice there was plenty of manuscripts that couldn't be found elsewhere and published elsewhere, and so the Venetians became sort of honorary Protestants in the eyes of the especially anti-papistic say supporters. Let's put it in this way. So I will try to interpret the question per se. That is to say, I don't want to this because there was actually another question that I remember that same author posed in another video, but I couldn't find it anymore. I think he deleted it, and it was going across the same pattern. It was actually yes, I remember it now. It was specifying about the wealth distribution among the Goths. So I can confidently assess that the question was going straight to, did the Goths have a special constitution back in the day that eventually sort of influenced the later juridical systems, and that we can sort of trace a broader European origin from, or something like that? Well, in that way, it's definitely not the case, and I explain specifically why. Right? Harrington, first of all, of course, didn't have. He was well educated for his time standards on these past topics, right? Politically, historically, juridically, etc. So he was, as far as I understand, he was not making gross approximations like you could imagine actually existing at the time if you read how, of course, still history was interpreted in a way or another. Harrington was sort of even cold, practical, pragmatic-minded individual, right? And he wanted essentially to stress the importance, for example, of greater distribution of wealth among the people, to also participate more directly into politics. It's all part of that process of modernization that Britain was undergoing at the time, and that he pointed out, of course, at the tension that had formed between the monarchy, the necessity of establishing a state, and the one of, say, those who would have to control that state. Right? We have seen it very often from a military point of view. What the ship money was about concretely was more than 10 times less than what eventually the British would spend for their army after the revolutions. And this is not just because, of course, Britain decuplicated her GDP at the time. It's of course about having essentially relegated the monarch to a, say, much narrower confine, right, and having a parliament with much greater prerogatives, and so on. And I will not digress on this. It's true that I don't talk much modern history, but we can start looking at those times, because at least back in the day, I had the privilege of having a very beautiful course actually on the British 17th century, and there is really a lot of aspects that, of course, are crucial as far as the development of the British Empire that start from there in great part. So Harrington is subtle enough for his own time standards, and he's not, say, stressing, as far as I understand, a historicistic interpretation. He's mostly concerned with how his country was governed at the time, right? And this sort of Gothic Constitution is a sort of synecdochical term to refer to a certain slightly ethnicistic historical concept, right? That would have been about the Goths having invented a constitution and the rest of Europe followed it. And this concept, of course, in itself, it cannot be applied historically because it never happened, right, to make the long story short. I am a medievalist. I studied history of law, and I made lots of videos about the Germanic ones. Specifically, there is one in general that is called The Laws of the Germanic Peoples that tells you pretty much what these constitutions, if you want to call them like this, were about, naturally within a context that is mostly the one of a statal establishment and territorialization, so something that actually takes place not in Germanic lands but in Roman ones, right? And at that point Romano-Germanic ones, but mostly through a process that made the Germans mostly trying to control and trying to salvage a Roman system, right, of state, of administration, of law, right? And different peoples had different, of course, different say stories in these various kingdoms, and the Goths paradoxically were actually among the most the least liberal ones, meaning that they were, as we said, essentially just some Roman monarchic creation on their own, right? As you know, the Visigoths were created essentially as a Roman army in Illyria. What we call the Visigoths, by the way, because they weren't quite called like that in that way. The Ostrogoths also were essentially literally sent from the same area in the following century to Italy to govern a fully functional Roman Italy on behalf of Constantinople. And the Goths, in this sense, say, you know, the history of the Visigoths, they settled in Aquitaine and gradually in Spain, right? So they established a kingdom there. The Italian Goths, let's say, were the most important. They were essentially able to vassalize the same Visigoths in the west and establishing a sort of Arian and pagan axis that encompassed most, in fact, of the northwestern Mediterranean, plus some areas of Central Europe that were afraid of Merovingian expansionism, and in fact trying to counter the Catholic Byzantine Frankish orthodoxy in the process. The Goths also lost to that, right? So I made a video about the significance of Clovis' baptism, I think, and why the Franks, the title is along his pattern, essentially substituted the Goths in the hegemony of Europe, something like this. And those two videos alone, I think, answer a lot of that. I still have to make a video about the Gothic and Burgundian laws that are the most important as far as this legal tradition is concerned, because given that these peoples were ruling in the most Romanized lands of the western half, right, of the Roman Empire, they also have the single most Romanized laws of all the Germanic peoples, and they're famous for this, meaning that these societies legally disciplined by these peoples in southern Europe were hardly distinguishable from the Roman ones broadly meant, for how, of course, it had been transforming across the centuries. Essentially, we're looking at the massive influence of the Theodosian Code, and after that, we actually don't know how much the Justinianian one circulated. It's a big open question, but in general, and definitely, the Goths are some of the least sort of original, in a Germanic sense, sort of legal producers, we can say, but this could have been Harrington's point in a way, because you see, if we had just wanted to say, well, there was a sort of Germanic constitution, and we were the Anglo-Saxons, and so as the common law, of course, says, this is the natural, divine law given to our people, and so there's all the common law tradition as far as the regulation of also monarchic prerogatives and one of the people are concerned, etc. And Harrington is again very aware about English juridical history from those later times. So again, I do not know in extreme detail how he was just reconstructing the entire migration era time. Our, of course, most recent acquisitions about Gothic legislation he didn't have, right? But again, it was not his point. So if the other question was, how did the Goths distribute their wealth? Well, actually, the Goths distributed their wealth in the most similar way that the Romans did, from a Germanic point of view, right? Why? For the obvious reason that at least the countries over which they ruled had remained untouched in the internal mechanism. Essentially, they were ruled by a very powerful aristocracy that was also Roman, right? Essentially, the Goths moved in as the army of a Roman state, right? As federati through the hospitalitas, right? They took the place of what were the regional armies there, and in some cases, they deposed the Roman aristocracy. This is especially true in Aquitaine in Spain, because it was a, let's say, more distant land from the center of the same Western Roman Empire, and also from the Eastern one that remained later standing. And there were other peoples who had caused a bit of mess during the migration, namely the Vandals in Spain, etc. So, just to make an example, the Visigoths hardly ever controlled the very south of the country. They had problems controlling the Ebro Valley as well in the northeast. They lost eventually Aquitaine to the Franks. So these were all areas that were substantially and gradually, destatalized, right, in a fashion that would turn, in fact, the Visigothic kingdom in a very similar fashion to the Merovingian one, a sort of feudal system of sort with major landlords that were preventing the decentralization of the system, say the survival of the public state, such. But they were at that point Romano-Germanic. You have essentially Romano-Gothic rulers that all have their latifundian and rule as lords from there. The church in there is also very powerful. The kings of Toledo are basically checked by the local ecclesiastical councils, of which also the nobility participates to, and hardly their rule stretched functionally in the range of 30 kilometers from the city. Right, the Ostrogoths had it easier for many reasons. First of all, their settlement was much more mediated in a sense, and let's say obsequious towards the Roman aristocracy in Italy than what it had been the Visigothic one in the west. Italy had been, again, largely untouched by migrations. Even the Sacs of Rome, etc., were pretty tidy business compared to how this was normally done elsewhere. The country had never been fundamentally ravaged by, let's say, an armed invasion against the same Romans, right? That we look at the same Visigoths, etc. These were essentially the same Roman army, namely, that was searching for money, and that even spared, in fact, the Roman establishment, as far as, even though that they had been treated horribly by it, because they knew that through that they could get their land in the west also officially. It was a great issue in general. But there is no doubt that, and as I explained in that same video about Ostrogothic Italy, this land was the most successful and functional case of Romano-Germanic integration in the entire picture, right, in Europe. there would be more to say. I think the Merovingians there carried out something very interesting as well. There was a great cooperation. But if we speak of Romanity, so given that we're not talking about the Franks but the Goths, definitely Theodoric's Italy is the proof of what fundamentally a Gothic constitution would have worked like. Essentially, the Germans make up the army, right? They're settled essentially as military colonists. The country is ruled by a shared consistorium in Ravenna, in which both the Roman senators and the Germanic chieftains sit on equal ground. The first thing that Theodoric does when he conquers Ravenna from Odoacer and killed him was to go to Rome, and even though he was an Arian, to render homage to the Catholic Pope. And even though, of course, the tensions between the Romans and the Germans did exist, because essentially you had a Roman aristocracy that wanted to come back under, say, its own decentralized control from Constantinople, not having these barbarians in their home, everything kept working in the late antique Roman way, right? And so the Goths actually were disciplining, and this is the case also for the Burgundians, and again, also the West Goths, in fact, a society that they hoped to, first of all, turn in the same direction, right? And mostly were basing themselves on the Roman constitution and issuing it, say, their laws their own way, but essentially disciplining that specific society, right? And in order to just keep things running, as, say, functionally as they were in these countries. So hardly a truly Gothic constitution per se. Of course, the Goths had their own internal, say, ways, right, that were disciplined in these laws as well, but that were to quickly adapt to the much wider Roman majority. As it happened, by the way, pretty much in any other Romano-Germanic kingdom. And so there is technically nothing there about constitute a Gothic influence restructuring the specifically, say, European, or even in this case, sort of post-Roman, because, of course, Britain counts as that for Harrington's too, a way of law. Right, they were obviously being civilized by the same Roman customs that were much more advanced. I mean, Roman law had institutions. It was a very complex, sophisticated system. For a society, it was dramatically more complex than the Germanic one. And so what you have is that, of course, the early Middle Ages kick in together with things like the Byzantine reconquest and the Longobardi invasion of Italy, the Islamic conquest of Spain, and the destruction of the Visigothic kingdom. So technically there is nothing remaining from a Gothic constitution, right? In Harrington's time, say in the age of confessional clashes, you had, I don't know, the Spanish and the Swedes literally, say, going at one another as a bit like the extremes of the most Catholic, the most Protestant peoples, regarding the legacy of the Goths in an ethnic sense, right? With the Spanish going as far as saying, since the Goths came from Scandinavia, which it's something that we, let's say, it is true largely, but it's not that that there was a, say the Goths that settled in Spain later on had much necessarily to do with who lived in Sweden at the time. But aside from that, the sense is that the Swedes, of course, instead said, well, we are actually the descendants of the Goths, because, as we know, that was also a title formally that the Swedish kings always maintained. I'm saying this because, of course, Harrington's time is a time in which they cared about these things as well, and so the idea of ethnicizing, the way of saying the Gothic constitution, is a bit like a proto, I wouldn't say Gibbonian way of thinking, but it's still in a world in which there was a distinct idea of who the Romans were, the Germans were, and even tending towards a positive and unsophisticated direction. But that's not the point. Again, I think Harrington's work is very interesting and worth of praise also from a historical and juridical point of view. The point I was making, rather, is the fact that there was no Gothic constitutional legacy, because simply there was no, Gothic legacy that we can document juridically surviving whatsoever. Essentially the Italians were formed by the Longobards invasion that brought the Longobard law, which is actually a much more egalitarian law, in fact, than the one that the Goths had, because they were just simply following the pattern of late Roman sort of, there is one guy who has all the land and all the others are basically serfs. There is no doubt that the Goths were bringing with them an idea of their own freedom as Goths, but this is also something we'll have to look at here. Again, Spain doesn't practically have much of a Gothic legacy per se, right? This is something that was, again, reivindicated in an ethnicistic sense later on, but the truest identity that eventually you have in the Reconquista is the Christian one, not much the Gothic one per se, and consider that actually the far north had been conspicuously first of all, separated from and fighting against the Goths that were essentially the masters of the Mezzeten, that were launching these raids in the north against, in fact, the same raids of these essentially Celto-Roman people, right? And so, yes, there is some Gothic legacy also in the Reconquista, indeed, and we cannot obviously unsee the fact that the same Visigothic society had kept being like the Spanish one throughout even the Islamic domination and the later Christian reconquest, some features of that. But in general, they are very different times and places, and you cannot quite say, well, look, this is a Gothic system. No, right? Especially considering the originary Germanic people, which is, in a sense, what Harrington was instead identifying like. Harrington uses, in this sense, the Gothic Constitution in a bit of a broader generic terms, right? Constitutional monarchy, right, in which the people have a substantial capacity, obviously still an elite, but still based on a larger pool, right, than say demographically than the previous system in terms of individual rights, right? And again, the fact that Harrington puts a very clear divide between also his own times and the Gothic ones, speaking of the various, again, the Saxons, the Normans, etc., shows you that he did not intend to stress an actual historical legacy and continuity, if not as saying, look, the Goths did this in the past. And even though there may have been a trace there, namely in the concept that the Germanic peoples at large, given what we just said about the Goths, that were rather instead influential from a, say, ethnic background for the nature of the lands that they ruled on, re-equilibrated the late antique times. Say, I don't know whether Harrington talks about the Longobards, for example, or the Franks, for that matter. But maybe he really does, especially as far as England and the Normans, etc. But, so from Western France, I intend. But I don't think this is also the point of the question either. The wealth among the Goths was distributed according to a criterion of personal worth. Right, these peoples didn't really have a sense of equality as the moderns had wanted to attribute them. The same is valid for the Roman one, because Harrington actually speaks positively of that too. You see, the ideal Romano-Germanic base was that there was a sort of public authority embodied by the king that was in theory to be the actual overlord of the system. Why? Because if he could, first of all, he was God sent, right? But more concretely, he was properly capable of ruling over the entire thing, and as such, this somehow pertained to them. This is fascinating because only those Germanic peoples that were able to establish a state, like in the Romano-Germanic case, were capable of claiming, on the same base, by the way, of the Roman public domain, a sense of there is a public authority, a sort of an abstract concept for which, a bit like the one that we have today, that with a state that is the source of law and can essentially intervene in all the territory without, say, on the base of a constitution, but with full coercion, as far as, it doesn't matter whether you accept this constitution or not on the land, you're still subjected to it, right? This is the world in which we live in. And of course, from a 21st century perspective, it feels like what happened in the 17th, the 18th century, again, is the sort of freeing of the people. This is not technically what happened there. It's a very complex topic that I address mostly in that video called, like, Between Modernity and Tradition. It was about the French Revolution specifically. And it's in fact what did not exist, nor in Roman nor Gothic times, right? There were always some sort of ranks, right, in the hierarchy, right? There were some people who were literally worthier than others. This is not to say, just like it happened in the 17th century, where already there had been, after all, in the West, a sort of flattening of the idea that there was a sort of greater equality in front of the law, even for people of a certain status, etc. This had been already sort of modernized and secularized. The Romans, the Germans, believed that every person has a greater worth, and this is not just a matter of judicial reasons. Say, you killed this man, and so how much do you have to pay for his value? But they attach to this worth a right to power, as a matter of fact, right? So these people exercised literally an imperium on other peoples. These were all clientelarist systems, right? So it's like the pater familias in the Roman Institute. It was the same one in the Germanic world. A father, the family had the right of life and death over the members of his family, because he was the one who was really in charge of the whole thing, right? The meaning of this is, of course, that there wasn't a sort of true equality among anyone. There weren't technically even proper some classes, right? When the system territorializes, the Germans pass from the Barbaricum, from a semi-nomadic status, at least, in fact, if they were migrating into these other Roman lands, to effect a territorial state, where, of course, there had to be a boundary between, say, classes of recruitment. How much land do you own? And so how much do you have to contribute for the army, right? This existed technically also in the Barbaricum, but it was much looser, as much as the political cohesion of these groups in the first place, that united only to invade, historically. And so there was an enormous mitigation, let's say, and more properly, a reformation of the same Germanic laws in the moment in which they were territorialized, right? When you look, for example, at the Edictum Rotary for the Longobards, you realize that, yes, it is basically the single closest law that we have in time and in place to the, say, original one of the Germanic confederacies in the Barbaricum, but it's obviously designed for not just for the Longobards, but essentially now for a broader population of all those who lived within the boundaries of the kingdom, which is a concept that is completely alien to anything that existed outside of the Roman world, and as far as these peoples from Central and Northern Europe were concerned, and that therefore not just applies to essentially those Romans that would become Longobards in the process, right? And so as a national people, right? But it was also, in fact, a change for the needs, first of all, of the establishment of a monarchy, which was already something that these peoples originally did not believe in, right? Remember that the Longobards had been, in part, mediated by they had been sent to Italy like by the Byzantines in a similar way to the other peoples, but they were much less Romanized than the Goths at the time they settled, right? It's not that the Goths were this monstrous level of Romanization, telling you the truth, but there is no comparison with these others, right? So what we see naturally is something very different from the Gothic Constitution, because even if we admit that there was, of course, a developed form of juridical administration also in the semi-nomadic confederacies, this was still based on the various clans and mostly the relation with the leader of the migration, and these systems were pretty unstable, to say the least. So whenever we can document their laws, they're already modified for the needs of a territorial state, right? And we know that in the in the Barbaricum, the sense was that every clan was out there on its own. They would recognize out of authority this common ruler, which has, of course, some similarities to how any government is actually recognized before and after these times. But that doesn't technically even have a true Gothic sort of homogeneity, right? This is an enormous issue because in Germanistics, we recognize that there were some peoples, like the Longobards, for example, that remained much more unitary throughout their migration as opposed to the Goths, right? Especially but in fact, the peoples that we call the Goths, that is a term which is, again, difficult to comprehend properly in the ethnographic sense at some point, or how they had originated and why they were called like this. Of course, I made lots of videos about the Goths, also on the issue of the Scandinavian origin. I actually believe that, of course, the original core was likely, right, from Scandinavia. Many people doubt of that because they say we don't actually have the full evidence of that. It's possible that some of these groups were properly established in a sense of political identity well after they had left Scandinavia, etc. This is not so important because, again, it also depends on what these ethnonyms meant for them, but they also had a connection with the places of origin later on. It's just that they began to accumulate so many other peoples, and especially the Goths among the Sarmatians, the Celts, the Proto-Slavs, say even Romanized population. That is incredibly difficult and not even very sensible to pretend that by the time they established in the Roman Empire, they had a sort of constitution that was just different, let's say, in a recognizable fashion compared to the traditional one of, again, every clan on its own. They discipline law internally, like essentially a mafia group, right? And then they just recognize this leader. After all, this is for military purposes, by the way, the ones connected with the migration. Consider that the clans were logistically autonomous. They produced everything on their own. Weapons, they supplied themselves. Of course, during the migration, you had to put some resources in common in order to allow this leader to, of course, have a political and strategic control on the wall, but it was, again, a very complicated thing to do. Even a more compact people like the Longobard one had an incredibly, and especially because it really came more straight out of a more readily identifiable Germanic background, an homogeneous one in this sense, that didn't have really a sense of monarchy, right? The monarch was just a guy that would lead will let these clans and then when the migration was over, in theory, these clans had to be on their own, free, right? So this even through the Gothic experience in the Roman army, etc., the Goths may have matured a different view, but it's still influenced from the Romans. So no, there is no such thing like a particular way the Goths would leave a mark in the European, as a whole, juridical tradition, not even in the West as such, right? The main juridical influences are the Frankish one, definitely also the Anglo-Saxon one for Britain, the Longobarд one, and that's pretty much it. I mean, the what would become Germany had this sort of more provincial-based sort of local tradition. There would remain a problem even for the development of a monarchy later on. Again, in Spain, you have basically the Arabs taking over, and you have from the Christian north just a very different sort of way of handling things. Here, I will not even digress on the relations with the church that are even more complex, right? But so Harrington's insight in that sense is merely, again, it's a synecdoche. It's symbolical and by principle, right, and theoretically so. The interesting thing, by the way, about wealth distribution that the author asked is that we definitely see that there was a saying about Ostrogothic Italy that specifically, and it was not particularly different from Spain, right, that said something like the first of the Goths want to be Romans, right, and the last of the Romans want to be Goths. This is a very meaningful picture of the war, because essentially what it means is that the Gothic elites wanted to be fully integrated as Roman ones, because they saw how powerful these landowners really were, right? And in this sense, there was a tension because their juridical background was sort of more egalitarian theory. So there was a fear from the same Germanic freemen that, of course, the settlement in a Roman land would bring the land, the Germanic chieftains to become landowners, just like the Roman senators. And this is technically what happened in many ways also in Visigothic Spain and in Frankish Gaul, to different degrees, but fundamentally so, because at this point there had been no major impact, right, in the system. Say Italy would be unhinged in this way by the Gothic War of essentially Byzantine reconquest, which dramatically destroyed the latifundium. And so this paradoxically spread wealth more evenly later, especially considering that Longobards took over, and they had already a type of law that, according to the traditional guys, was sort of giving more importance to small landowners, right? Even though it was based on the same hierarchical clientelary concept. And so the Italian population in the Longobards kingdom was subsumed within this system, right? And so, as we've seen much, also what we've seen about the Italian communes, let's say the Lombard League, the spirit of independence, this juridical liberty that remained uninterrupted also from technically Roman times, especially for the cities, right? But this is something that was happening also in the countryside, differently from north of the Alps, where actually freemen were just being brought under the elites in this sort of Gothic, allegedly, system, which is similar to Harrington's time. So, I mean, at least in medieval times, this system had evolved with, say, a distant monarch, and Harrington actually envisages the importance of a monarchy as well. So this is from one side. From the other, the last of the Romans wanted to be a German, of course, meant that the last of the Romans, there were really many demographically, as in theory free colony, but there were de facto serfs working in the latifundia, wanted to be freer, and the Germanic model presented with that higher degree of liberty as such, even though, as we've seen, this even average Germanic freemen weren't faring too well, given that their elite were consistently more powerful, and the longer they stayed in this Roman land, they would become ever more powerful and the freemen ever less free. And this is pretty self-evident from the same Visigothic Spain. I made a video recently about this. I mean, it was essentially a feudal land, right? The saying goes, if we're not talking about Gaul, I mean, the Franks there formed this exactly because they kept the Gallo-Roman elite in charge together by merging it with the Frankish one, right? As their elite essentially merged with the Gallo-Roman one, right? And the average Frankish guy was not really enjoying a dramatic liberty. And this is the point I wanted to get to, that whenever we see, say, but were some areas where people were freer, right? And people often get confused with this. So being freer from a juridical point of view, or let's say from a political point of view, because there is an important difference also in this, doesn't mean that you're actually living in a better condition, right? If we look, for example, at the Frankish world, you have the Neustria, where you have this, again, Gallo-Roman Frankish elite establishing itself with a monarchy, with a continuity with the previous system, and gradually making the peasantry ever more subjected to this elite. Right, admittedly, France maybe is not the best example because they established such a deeply monarchical and nobiliary and elitistic system that, let's say, also the peasantry wasn't living exactly in such a good way. But the idea that the Roman world would have been, just because it was based on the latifundium, just a worse place where to live compared to the Barbaricum, this is not entirely the case, right? Remember that the Goths made exactly the same thing before we were saying, but the last of the Romans wanted to be a German. Yes, but those were Germans who had the utmost privilege of ruling a Roman land on the tip of their spears, and so they were essentially, they had achieved what from the Barbaricum this would have seen as the greatest thing ever possible to be realized, right? But if you, again, had looked into, I don't know, Scandinavia at the time, yes, people were freer than, I don't know, an Italian peasant, but freer to live like what, exactly? First of all, freer there is not that there was a constitution that allowed people to be, say, to have rights to live free, right? Communities were self-regulating, again, in this mob-style fashion, for which essentially was one boss ruling, the others had more or less to obey, and this was the general rule of the land that was, in this sense, however, dramatically fragmented and unstable, politically speaking. And life sucked, and of course the life standard, say, the quality, the wealth, the life expectancy was dramatically lower. It's put in it everything you can imagine, of course, in terms of weather, whatever. But you see, this is not the product of a constitution. This is the product of exactly of the fact that there is no such thing like a constitution. There is no such thing like a state, which, of course, in a contractualistic way in the 17th century was a completely different story. And as I was hinting at before, what actually happened in Europe is that, paradoxically, the lands that would have been allegedly freer in this sort of stamp of tribesmen that we want to think, because the modern populism wants to make you think that you are essentially a tribesman living free in a world of freedom, right? No, you're not free. You live in a world of liberty, right? For a system that essentially provides for you and that you largely live in a parasitic relation with, and that protects your rights, right? In the Middle Ages, in the migration era, in the ancient world, there is no such thing except a bit, again, in essentially the more civilized states, right? Not even in Rome, where there was, of course, a great care about maintaining the land pacified and, open to trade, and so there had to be a deterrence, a policing, etc. Of course, only the rich people could afford a good legal protection, right? And the concept was based, as we were saying before, on the traditional concept shared by the Romans and the Germans ancestrally, that if you were more powerful, it's because, say, divine power had endowed you with that responsibility and faculty to also rule and take care of other people, right? And throughout the early Middle Ages, what happened with the also the decline of the Roman world, and so also the Roman law, how it had been exercised, is that paradoxically those areas that maintained more the Roman state and administration and literacy and per capita wealth, if they had been lucky enough to do so, but also because the lands were just more developed historically in the south, would maintain greater individual liberty, right? Instead, in places like Germany, or say even more if you go to northeastern Europe, etc., the situation would dramatically worsen for the freedmen, to the point that in a way or another you were always under somebody else's rule, right? Even personally, and sometimes even juridically, right? So this is a bit the reality of the world at the time. So you can't say that even in the Mediterranean people were, again, free, because there is no such thing like true freedom, but at least their individual liberty was more legally vindicated from a political, military, and social point of view than it would be in other areas that, especially, like you can think even of England or of Germany, etc., that would eventually develop in the modern age to a point that, of course, was particularly advanced, like in Harrington's time, that we're looking at, this is true for by the way, for England specifically. Telling the truth, Germany wasn't like that even later, until very late in time. But so with a dynamism, with a mechanism that actually has nothing to do with a allegedly Gothic constitution, right? With England, it happened because after the actual isolation and even relative backwardness of the country after the war of the 100 Years' War, colonialism happened. At least, the English began to look at their naval potential in a way that it could start, expanding over other communities overseas, and of course exploiting their resources. It's completely fine, by the way. I have nothing morally against that. If you're a superior civilization, you have absolutely the right to exploit other peoples that were actually growing, thanks to the same thing, and or at least if they went under and they suffered from it, it's because they were underdeveloped and so not capable of defending their own rights. And this is always like this historically. And so you arrive to a point in which relatively, anachronistic monarchy in England is, at least in the type of power that it was actually essentially to regain. In fact, Harrington, again, if I'm not wrong, he has a negative opinion of the Tudors, right? And he thinks that they undermine a bit the spirit of the Gothic Constitution that had in part survived throughout in the Anglo-Saxon common law, etc. But this is exactly the point, the sense that the various codes, right, of different peoples really evolve for reasons that have really not much to do with any sort of horizontal division. Here, the alleged Gothic Constitution, what the hell is that even supposed to mean? And that actually are essentially instead in a vertical spectrum of civilizational development, and what they look like at the bottom is pretty much the same. And then you have a significant development that takes on specific characteristics depending on the pre-existing ones of the country. And this is pretty much it, right? Because otherwise different countries have also different legal traditions. Not all, say, common law is the same also outside the Anglo-Saxon world, because everything was actually common law before, right? The Roman one was also reintroduced at some point during the modern age because it was more functional to statal administration, etc. But it happens with a different character in every land, right? And this is something that we will talk again in the videos about medieval and also modern law in part. But this is at least how I think the question is better answered, right? So nothing particular about the Goths having a more balanced constitutional system that ruled over others, because it basically collapsed and it was mostly based on a Roman system. And other peoples in Europe had essentially a different way of development, and actually those who maintained a more similar constitution to the ones that the Goths originally, even before migrating into the say the Roman Empire, were essentially the most underdeveloped countries in Europe for a long time right? So the most, again, sort of even as it would evolve in a feudal sense, right? As many areas of Eastern, Northern Europe would remain, very backward way for up to very few hundreds years ago, right? So nothing really flattering about this legacy. There is a civilization, which is something that goes beyond individual peoples, and that, however, in this case, doesn't quite match the Gothic legacy per se, right? Because eventually all countries had to provide themselves with a statal law of some sort in order to curb the feudal one, and this is true in Scandinavia, this is true in Britain, this is true pretty much everywhere. The slower it went, the least the development and sort of the more difficult it was, right? And obviously the same Goths wanted to preserve a statal system when they seized it from the Romans, and too bad that it went badly for them, and or at least that that sort of public order could not be preserved, because still throughout the Middle Ages the most liberty-based system was actually stemming from there, right? And again, there are shades, because again, not everything that survives as an elite, in fact, is necessarily Roman, right? Again, the Germans also had their own very elite system by the time they settled. So this dichotomy that you often find among kids that are obsessed with the sort of, Germanic salvation from the terrible Romans is based on the assumption that the Germans cared for individual freedom, but actually all they did was trying to prevaricate each other, and the only reason why they couldn't is that they kept flying low, because they didn't have enough resources to do that, and as soon as they had them, they did that. But also, when they had their enlightened rulers that ruled on Roman lands, they also instead understood that it was important to curb the excess of the nobility, to have a more governable system, right? And this is also a pattern that you find among the same Romans, etc. And so this is pretty much my take on this. And again, I have to answer the other question. We can go on talking about this stuff in another video if anyone's interested. But again, I made plenty of videos about the migration era, the Goths, the Germanic law, and we'll keep doing that, so you can really check that out. Now, the other question about the Capetians in the Kingdom of France that partly touch on what we're discussing right now says, great video, have a question, okay. Your videos have given me a greater understanding of the importance of the French, originally Frankish, monarchy, especially great on the role of the Merovingians. But I now come away with a broader question. How did the Capetian line manage to last for so darn long? As you have noted throughout your videos, the Capetians basically ruled France all way through 1792, with the cadet branches being Capetians as well. Of course, several of factors are clear. The early Capetians did an amazing job producing legitimate male heirs and leaving the right amount of time so that their heirs came to power at a point where they were set up to have nice long reigns, right? But that can hardly be the whole story. producing a consistent supply of legitimate heirs is great, but obviously it wouldn't help much little under the older Germanic inheritance laws that led to the constant fragmentation of the Merovingians, and in a somewhat different way the Carolingians. So the kingdom had indivisible, at least not divisible, into entities that could claim equal status with the kingdom. Some fragmentation was inevitable until later in history, but the key was fragmentation into subordinate entities. But that still doesn't really answer the question. While I may be overstating this factor based on being an American with more knowledge of English history, I think it generally true that as a medieval monarch you have a lot to fear from your close relatives, or in the period of the direct Capetians, from those with the highest feudal titles, rather than close relatives, as agnatic primogeniture was not what it would become, especially if you are young, incompetent, etc. They can say, quote, "We both have royal blood, but I have the strength that makes me a true king," but somehow the Capetians were able to avoid this. Of course, in general, the West Frankish kingdom and French kingdom are very successful. Over the years, there were many crises and long periods of pain. Especially during such times, there are many instances of influential nobles trying to manipulate the monarch to their own ends, obtain greater autonomy, or collaborate with hostile foreign powers. While France did have a remarkable level of institutional and proto-bureaucratic development, that is hardly a sure protection against usurpation. It seems like a combination of the Merovingian sacrality of royal blood combined with ... some sort of pacifying influence that checked the normal threat from close kin feudal magnates. Right, so this is a very interesting question, telling the truth. And the last aspect is key. You said that you're American with a greater English history knowledge that somehow made you see the thing as like relatively more unstable, at least, with a more checked monarchy, right? Than the French one that, as we know, at the end of the Middle Ages had gained, even from a juridical point of view, just a bit, to remain a bit stuck to the previous topic, acquired this sense that the king could really, for example, legislate, filling some lacunas some gaps in the law, as opposed to the English one that was much more supervised in doing this. So why, right? As you have observed, the longevity of the Capetian line can be attributed to several factors. You know that the early Capetians were successful in producing legitimate male heirs and living long enough to ensure that their heirs came to power at a point when they were set up to have long reigns. This, of course, doesn't make it all. There is a level of accident, dynastically, biologically, about that. So there is one, say, I will answer you as a polemologist and also someone who has a background of history of religions. So first of all, there is a passage here that is the establishment of the Capetian dynasty in the particular historical time in which this happened, right? Essentially, the Carolingians had extinguished themselves, and the Capetians rose to power in a moment in which the Western Frankish kingdom was, as you know, significantly fragmented, right? The reason why this kingdom was so fragmented, actually, is that paradoxically it was the most developed of all from an institution of the former Carolingian Empire, from an institutional point of view, right? And or at least from a strictly imperial and military point of view. I made a video that, I don't know if you watched it, but it's titled "On the Imperial Essence of the French Monarchy," that I think speaks volumes about how these guys saw the whole thing. And it is actually a mentality that dates back to Clovis. I mean, as I was saying before, like the average Franks were just very much, again, all these various clans that would watch out for one leader not to rise, right? But when Clovis becomes powerful enough, having seized Gaul, he basically and literally behands all the various concurrents to Frankish rule. He becomes the sole ruler in a sort of, in fact, at that point, Romano-Germanic fashion, aligning himself with the church and paving the way to his blood, his dynasty, his family, to a, in fact, sort of sacred rule. This picture, aside from the sort of expansion and collapse that France cyclically undergoes because of the enormity of the demographic and, broader resources in general, always maintained this core of extreme wealth concentration. I mean, France is it's the largest country in Europe at the time. It's the most populated. It's also the richest in absolute terms. I mean, the Merovingians and their successors had the greatest absolute amount of wealth under their control. However, this wealth is concentrated among an incredibly few amount of people, and the entire system is structured in this way, imperially, hierarchically, seigneurially, feudally, if you want. When the Capetians rise to power, what had happened is that with the collapse of the Carolingians, since there was really no other public state in this world, like the Franks have essentially a private nature of the public state. Everything belongs to the king, and when it's not the king, because in fact there is no state that can make the king rule everywhere yet, the various noblemen in the various provinces simply usurp public prerogatives, and they become huge provincial warlords on their own, right? Like little kings on their own. This doesn't happen factually anywhere else. I mean, to a degree, yes, it happens in all the post-Carolingian kingdoms, but the amount of wealth that is concentrated in the hands of these higher Frankish nobility has already established a sort of state, of these states within the state, right? So this initially put in dramatic peril the continuity of a Western Frankish monarchy, because you understand that in this space, it's just many competitors, right, against one another, and also pretty dangerous ones that can knock out one another. The same Capetians rise to power in this fashion, right, from the Counts of Paris, the Robertian line, etc. Now, they were, of course, soaked all together, especially in those areas in the northeast, in this sort of Frankish legacy in which basically everybody was married into one another, so it was just a mega sort of somatic blob that, lived across, so many noblemen that, were in another, even if they killed each other regularly, were feeling part of this greater sacred blood, right? And they were so superior to the others because this world was so socially segmented that they were also more eager to recognize each other's status as a sort of union, you can argue. This is what eventually Europe undergoes mostly during the 10th century, where the military classes, the military class, singular, was equal in all these post-Carolingian kingdoms, because the Franks had spread that degree of wealth, this concentration in the hands of the fewer, right? Hence the feudal nobility of Europe, also outside of France, that basically takes that sort of profile, right, and eventually expands into England, into Sicily, into Spain, into, say, Poland, Hungary, etc., right? So that also emerges from that sort of northeastern, that Neustrian world, we can argue, and part of the Austrasian one. What is the point here? That truly the Western Frankish kingdom risked to disappear. It was the least obvious to survive, right? Even the Burgundian kingdom, that, as you know, was a sort of an aborted state, at a point had a better chance to survive, even as a powerful reality, than the Western Frankish one, at least, if we stick to dynastic history and to some sort of, possibility of what could have happened with different sums of kingdoms across France, Italy, Burgundy, etc. I will not comment now on the Eastern Franks and on the Italics, but that's also interesting. I made lots of videos comparing this system, so if you're interested in that, you can search, especially in the playlist about post-Carolingian Europe that really dwells in depth these topics. The point, though, is that you have this very strong elite at the top. Whoever makes it to essentially oust one or the other later on basically finds an open path to enormous amounts of land. This, imperially speaking, I think is one of the single most important aspects to realize regarding the continuity of Capetian power. Right? Look at what happened de facto in the 12th and the 13th century, when the Capetians really essentially emerged from the Ile-de-France as their province, right? Of rule that was truly just a province, right? They didn't control much outside of that. Of course, there were connections as far as Catalonia, right? It was part of the Western Frankish kingdom. And paradoxically, even more with those, because they were so far away that they didn't really, they just wanted to see their position legitimized without fearing an expansion, a monarchic expansion. In the 13th century, the Capetians would knock at the door, the Catalonian door, paradoxically. But why? And this is the point, because once they knocked out, essentially they managed with, as we will see, very clever means, also involving the church, to, first of all, there had to be a king of the Western Frankish kingdom, right? Everybody in France, and I explain this often, like in any other kingdom, there was fighting against, say, the further centralization against the king, but all in all, they were all trying to be kings, right? And also in their own lands. So if you need a monarchy to legitimize your position, to be the de facto ruler of all these countries that the king cannot control directly anymore, and that, however, that has the public, sacred, universal authority of saying, look, well, yes, I will. You are officially now the lord of that land, right? I give you power, you give me power. This is, first of all, how the Capetians stayed afloat, at least how they established their own monarchy from there, from the Ile-de-France, because historically, like, think about Saint-Denis, Saint-Remy, Saint-Germain, Saint-Geneviève. I made a video about medieval Paris, the fact that, of course, that was becoming a proper capital over time. So those were just very developed areas. You have essentially the middle course of the Seine. Upstream, it's to say it's not a huge river at that point. Downstream, you have the Normans that settled there and even shield you from further attacks to Paris from there. In the east, I made a video series recently about the wars between the Western Franks and the Lotharingians, but Lotharingia is, in fact, a huge buffer state de facto between the Western and the Eastern Franks, and so essentially France would hardly be threatened from there. So, I mean, the Ottonians could, yes, even besiege Paris at some point, but, the Germans were just being Germans in Germany, and at least, being Germans in Italy as well, because that's what they saw as a much more politically fragmented, but also dramatically rich land, which better one this is, right? The Western Franks had, instead, they say, like Machiavelli said later on, right? Entering France is a mess. You can even take out the king, but you still have all these various princes that are sort of sub-kings that are very difficult to tame, and say the Germans didn't quite have the resources to centrally control Italy, for example. You can imagine France would have been impossible. So across the channel, you don't have essentially a threat per se, right? At least the Plantagenets, the Normans, the Plantagenets will become in as much as a dynastic sum that was still counted within actually the Western Frankish kingdom at the end of the day. It took, again, to lose the Frankish possessions for the Plantagenets to realize that they had to restart from a British, let's say, power rather than a French one, to which they had been more, in fact, historically, familiarly, and culturally connected. But what happens? So this area remains relatively sheltered. There are not other powers that are consistently trying to invade you, right? There is also this enormous wealth locally. So it's obvious that these various principalities, including the Capetian one, would reinforce themselves over time with surplus and surplus and surplus and surplus, so favoring all that sort of, as you defined it, institutional and proto-bureaucratic framework. It's a big word until the 13th century, so I'm not making the point that this was at the very beginning, but still we're talking about large amount of wealth and resources controlled by these guys. I mean, the fatness of the French soil in the Ile-de-France is the same reason why you have Gothic cathedrals, why you have also the prosperity of these lands in many ways. And the beauty of this is that, first of all, the more you do this, and more you're able to sort of co-opt at a higher level the nobility. Hence, you can marry, I don't know, the daughter of a powerful French prince, and if that line dies out, you will essentially inherit his entire provincial state, right? But even more so if this, in fact, dynastic sum is so big and is in the hands of the Angevins, for example, once you take that out from these lands that are evidently already to falling under this dynasty, already sort of losing gradually their own independence, you can simply take everything immediately. I mean, notoriously, the conquests of Philip II Augustus were just wow. Like, they swept basically entire France, right? They seized all at once. This was an enormous thing, because essentially, in order to achieve that, you just needed to substitute yourself at the top. Right? These were not countries that, as we've seen, where there was a strong popular resistance. We're all more or less peasants, plus this very powerful elite that, however, was in fact small. And when you are already well established and you fundamentally manage to win it, and as we all know, the Battle of Bouvines could have gone in a completely different way, right? At that point, the Angevins might have won, and so we wouldn't be talking about the Capetians. So they really risked hard, right? There wasn't anything deterministic about the Capetian survival. Actually, France routinely undergoes brutal, again, crises that seem to make it wipe out, but it's also very self-preserving because of this enormous local resources that can defend themselves. And when power reactivates, you really need one guy that, after the crisis, takes over again the system. And so the French monarchy manages to seize immediately. For example, think about southern France, Occitania, to be more precise. Those were areas that didn't have an imperial, monarchic, sort of feudal, hyper-nobiliar, stern, militaristic mentality like the northern one of the French monarchy. And so they simply gave way, right? The Capetians at that point could concentrate such a huge force that would simply wipe out the entire, say, the local resistance, right? It was all say, more complex in the way it happened, also dynastically. But there is no doubt, as we've seen in those videos about the historical region series, is that these French principalities lose steam once they enter in somebody else's orbit and they can't defend themselves anymore. So the power is so much shifted towards the top that since what you take away that elite, you can conquer the entire thing. In this way, when it happens, the Capetians can, as we have observed also in the question, essentially give to another guy of their family their own say one of these provinces, right? The various peers of France. Think about the county of Anjou, even say to the brother of the king of France. And from this standpoint, the question is, speaking of the thing you said, being an American with more knowledge of English history, the question is, at that point, who does care really to make an internal war to become a more powerful lord, when you can actually get even richer by expanding the system further, as the French did throughout the entire 13th century. That imperial mentality is what saves the internal stability as well. This had been true for the Carolingians. It's not that, I don't know, in the time of Charlemagne there was a functional state that preserved coups, right? Because there was a strong bureaucracy or whatever. No, they were conquering other peoples around, and so that was enough to redistribute wealth. As soon as that process stops, the people start fighting against one another. This is what happens again during the 100 Years' War, which, in fact, as you observe, it's one of those moments of crisis in which you have the Burgundian, read Valois, read Capetian branch of the same fact, Capetian monarchy, that even makes the English enter Paris. You have really lots of messed up things indeed happening, but surprise, surprise, this system comes back on its feet, because there was essentially no way again to simply control it in such an easy way without giving, say, at least a severe blow to the same pillars of the monarchy, which actually the time of crisis seems to strengthen dramatically, right? The 14th century crisis is actually boosting dramatically the sort of let's be under a single ruler, right? At least the one that up to this point has provided for us, because the majority of the population was already framed in that direction. The comparison with England in this sense is interesting, because what actually happens in England is that there is a much more parcelized level of power. The barons can essentially rule from a districtual basis that is much more heavily distributed, and that already from the 13th century, as you know, had been checking the monarchy, right? That up to that point actually was much more concentrated in power than the French one. Statally, right? And so this definitely helps, say, there are some, as we were saying before, characteristics of the English monarchy historically that also derives, as you know, with an excruciating relevance from those very times. But there is no doubt that in late medieval times, especially after the English lost the 100 Years' War, the system, having lost essentially a source of resources that essentially the English found abroad during their chevauchée in France, exploiting the collapse of this giant, right, that the French monarchy was, do not step further in a greater centralization. In other words, the barons had sort of crippled the capacity of the monarchy to expand on its own. In this sense, the Tudors have to thank the Wars of the Roses, because the House of Lords had been decimated, and so there had been a bit of a dynastic reunion. Then you exploit the Anglicanism to essentially loot the monasteries, and that's something that lasts, say, as a form of income overall, with the otherwise relatively undeveloped statual basis of the system until the Stuarts, and in this sense are very underrated for what they were trying to do, that the Parliament actually stripped them of, succeeding later on. With France, instead, you have an effective system for which it's truly the military and imperial character of the saying that allows that dramatic level of strategic projection of France, that capacity of recontrolling this enormous area, because you have an ultra elite that is fueled by enormous resources locally. Again, if you destabilize the elite, it's very easy to put the system in crisis. And the Capetians to hold back lots of, say, resources exploitation. For example, they would never arm much of their infantry. I made a video about the French native infantry of the Italian wars that is a bit like the problem. They didn't want to, like, if France had created her own legions, right? Like the Spanish or the Germans, they would have won the Italian wars. There is no doubt. But this could have created also a revolution at home because, of course, some veteran infantrymen that can successfully counter cavalry would be tempted to take out the nobility and create some sort of monstrosity in that regard from a nobility perspective. And so this wouldn't quite happen. But again, the fact that you could simply recompensate, in fact, your family members with enormous fiefs in France, in southern Italy, in Greece, in also, for example, in Provence, which was technically not France, was part of the Holy Roman Empire, even as the Kingdom of Burgundy. And that is really enough because you can exploit all of it, right? When do problems form instead between the various branches of the Valois when the system crumbles with the 100 Years' War, right? But still remains functioning after all, because during that previous phase of expansion, even in a non-theological and pre-planned way, they had been, in fact, establishing that level of sort of institutional proto-bureaucratic system, right? But when there is a moment of stability, you don't really need, in that regard, to turn against say, internally to say, okay, I want to be the king as your brother. Because, first of all, the enemies of France are always present. France has this important level of militarization later on because, of course, after the High Middle Ages, other powers form, and so there is always something to lose from, I don't know, the Spanish are, say, a threat on the southern coast. The English threaten to launch expeditions. The empire is recompacting, is creating problems. So, in a way or another, this huge territory is also vulnerable, right, to hold. And so when you are part of the Capetian house, you do not want to you feel very much what it means to be part of this system. You are already very rich and powerful. You do not need to destroy the system to be what, right? To destabilize even your own principalities for somebody else's profit and with lack of governability. I mean, you could succeed to the throne for some dynastic accident. Your children can. These are always going to be recognized as the greatest nobility of Europe, exactly because there is a functional France that works. So why, right, messing up the system? In England, it's instead very different, because in England you really have one house that can easily, even there they actually descend from the Plantagenets in many ways. There are many similarities in that regard, but they do not have that level of, let's say, clanic sort of international sacred recognition of themselves as a stock, for which also at home they can really dispensate power to everybody. England is smaller, is more compact, actually develops at some levels even some more concentrated forms of power, right? But they're regulated again by the barons that are basically the mobsters of the situation. This is also important. In France, you have the nobility becoming ever more segmented, and so paradoxically, part of the reason why the 100 Years' War was so massive for France, to say the least, from a military point of view, is that they had basically made the average nobility sunk, say the average aristocracy, knighthood, sinking, and they hadn't created enough bonds between the higher nobility and the rest. This caused some instability because when they had to summon the armies, I made multiple videos about this, they were somehow calling this lots of knights from everywhere, because it was a consistent amount of in absolute terms of French nobility, given the enormity of the country, in spite of how few people were actually in controlling the resources. In England, you don't have this. The barons fundamentally maintained that sort of, say, that monarchy on the same level of themselves, to some degree, at least as a broader estate, and they always challenge it. So it's easier to to challenge the same nobility and the same monarchy, and it is easier to cause from the within. Let's say one brother trying to usurp the throne, because if the barons were sort of behind you, you could easily, or you were maybe obliged to do so. Maybe you didn't even want to go against your own family members, but it was the only way even for you to remain in power. This is something that happens actually in other monarchies in Europe, where, especially in Central Europe, where it's a bit different from England. Of course, it's much tidier as a feudal and national monarchy. But we've seen that in those Central European countries, the monarchy is a failed state, right? It's the nobility that has managed to sabotage it, to eventually cripple the whole country, including themselves. But in the end, they retain, in fact, a sort of oligarchic power within the system, as if they were kings within the king. Kings within the kingdom. Well, the Capetians surpassed that for good and brutally in the 13th century. They create a huge gap, right? They are really at a higher level. And while the English monarchy also develops a specific mystique of itself, it does so again in a much more regulated way between the nobility and the monarchy, right? So, despite the similarities, France and England have this severe difference, right? There is also another factor, which here it's not in comparison with England, but in comparison, for example, with Germany. That is to say, the Capetian monarchies were aided dramatically by the fact that they were able generally to maintain good relations with the Roman Church, right? Even in this, the French were very Caesar papistic, so they think about Gallicanism. They truly believed that even that the king was a sort of at the head of the Gallic Church, right? But still remaining Catholic, right? Not causing a schism. And even later on during the wars, the confessional clashes, even though there were lots of Protestants in France, of course the monarchy remained Catholic, the state remained Catholic. This is radically important because France forms with the church the Guelph axis. The Capetians, remember what I said here about the fact that internal stability of France was due also to the fact that they could conquer other lands outside of that. Charles of Anjou, the crusade against the Germans in southern Italy, it was yet another massive feudal kingdom, and so it just ceased like that, right? Aside from the later problems, but the relations with the church were at that point paramount in order to further stabilize the legitimacy of the Capetian monarchy. This is particularly important. Why? Because if you look at Germany, for example, you have it was an elective monarchy of the Central European type that in fact fails in the 13th century, exactly in the moment in which France instead takes off, right, and sort of takes the place of the empire as well as the superpower, and thinks of the empire, right? Philip IV explicitly said, just like Boniface VIII, and quarreling about this, to be Caesar, to be the emperor, right? And even if Boniface VIII and Philip IV could harass one another, Philip would steal the papal treasure, with the colonnes, Ghibellines, etc., and all this stuff, Guillaume de Nogaret, etc. They're still allies, no matter what, because France protects the papacy and the papacy protects France. And France does not have, at this point, much of a, need, for example, to invade northern and central Italy that she manages to hegemonize through the Sicilian kingdom, but not to conquer, also because they had literally defeated the empire at the peak of its power, so that was not really a prudent thing to do. Also, of course, the empire was a bit of a problem east of France, but now that the fact it was collapsing was good, so they could at least keep expanding in the Mediterranean, essentially doing what the Hohenstaufen weren't able to do at the end of on the longer run. You have Charles of Anjou arriving one step away from recapturing Constantinople before, if it hadn't been for the Sicilian Vespers, triggered in fact by the Aragonese and the Byzantines. So all sort of bad things happened. Then there is the crisis of the Middle Ages again, that for France especially means 100 Years' War. But you understand at that point that the relation with the church had somehow salvaged France from, say, accusations, excommunications, right? That had, for example, crippled the German national monarchy. I mean, if you look at what happened with the investiture struggle, essentially with Worms, the German state, for what they had tried to establish there against all these various provincial ethnic duchies, suffered a massive blow by the papacy, and there is a further feudalization and privatization of the system. The monarchy loses a lot of steam in that regard, and that was a heavy thing, right? Imagine that happening with France, like the Pope, everything the French king does, excommunication, right? That would have significantly crippled the Capetian monarchy and would have perhaps make it abort, even as a state, and as a line at some point. Instead, all the papal blessing as far as the succession, the various rights, the wealth accumulation was something that the Capetians always had as covered back, right? And that helped them enormously, to say the least. France was, in this sense, not excessively threatening for the papacy, which felt a bit pressured only after the Angevins conquered Sicily. But even after that, again, they were mostly about Constantinople and the Holy Land, so technically even things that were okay for the papacy, plus, say, creating a very important, powerful counter-altar to the Holy Roman Empire that was still there, right? There would still be some Germanic expeditions to Italy that were, in fact, to bring to direct war, at least between the emperor and the Angevins of southern Italy, not much with France, because that they had, in this sense, the luxury of acting as two separated kingdoms, and so that's also an advantage, right? So this is also the deal. France has a real empire, and it's sort of dumb to undermine it. And even when you see that, of course, during the 100 Years' War, this system is in crisis and dramatically shrinking in resources and possibilities, like most powers at the time, but with, in this sense, more macroscopic effects for such a leviathan like France, you can appreciate the fact that the Burgundians, for example, even when undermining the kingdom, still retain an enormous ambition and create a sort of parallel state, and across the same France and the Holy Roman Empire, and at the end of the day, they're still a French power of some sort that is that eminently princely in nature, and that surpasses essentially most, even, for example, German ones, or most Italian ones, and that is fascinating, because at least in those countries, of course, that were powerful, at some point even more powerful states than Burgundy, but the feudal nature and the fact that we're still the same Valois Capetians, well, would make them, it's just like through marriage, if you see how they absorb, for example, the French absorbed Britain in the end, through dynastic ties. Even with Burgundy, actually, they could have done the same. They could have been the French to marry Mary of Burgundy, right? Instead, Louis XI opted for conquering Burgundy, and so getting the problem out of the way, because otherwise it would have been like Brittany, an extenuating thing, and you may never know what would have happened from the imperial side, by the way, from a military point of view. So this world was sort of meant to agglutinate further, right? And the fact that, again, they the Capetians were the last ones to emerge victorious on the various principalities of France that were not as well placed or well developed or connected or simply provided with that plus that of course the royal authority has, the support of the church, that was always, I mean, the Church of France, not just the papacy. I mean, the fact that of course also in Germany, also in England to some degree, aside from episodes like the ones of Thomas Becket, etc., the church had always sided with the monarchy because they understood that, say, alone, without protection, they would have had the worst against unchecked secular noblemen. And that's why an extra help to the Capetians, that at some point, however, have to check also the ecclesiastical power because it's enormous as well. And they have to boost the communes in order to create problems to the bishops, especially the powerful ones in northeastern France. So it's let's say the bigger the system and the greater privilege of ruling from Paris and being the king and having this sort of, say, brings with lots of risks, but allows you to sediment a greater power in the Seine basin. That is effectively the ones that arrives to dominate, because the Loire was more like a frontier area, right? It was more important, but it was still less, it was something that had not developed across another power. This dating back from Merovingian times, they had crushed across the Loire the Visigoths and seized that land. And so I think this aspect is fascinating, that the north was from Merovingian, Carolingian times more militarized. It's the one from which the couché lance, the thickly packed, coordinated cavalry charges, etc., it all developed. And this is just a more rapacious, authoritarian, and sort of imperialistic power, which crushes the somehow more civilized and literate and sensual powers of the south. At least this is the stereotype, right? Even if in France, of course, there were lots of other lords. And through the fact that there were already, like in Carolingian times, from Merovingian times, set for launching like an offensive on the other countries, right? That the Franks really have an empire because they control other peoples, such as the Aquitanians, the Burgundians, the Alemanni, right? There is, interestingly enough, the idea also that the Merovingians inherited in some way all the estates that had been used to fuel, to supply the Roman legions on the Rhine, right? This is not technically what happened just in a direct way, but it is indeed true that, for example, even from Roman times, Belgica had been used as a militarized frontier that had to sustain tens of thousands of soldiers permanently. That is something which the Franks managed to couple again with the Gallo-Roman administration, with the sort of frontier area that had also developed further into, thanks also to their own personal settlement. In later times, there is no doubt that they were somehow more warlike, right? So also the agnatic thing that you're talking about, that is something that the Franks take away very, doesn't disappear early, but say the dynastization of the power accelerates dramatically. I mean, this is not just a matter of law, this is also a matter of how much power there is in the hands of these people, and again, how much they could be kept content with huge chunks of the kingdom. Still subordinated, as you notice, to the greater system. There was the same one sponsoring you, so in general, at least, during the moments of stability. So this is the point. Then, of course, the entire structure of this system favored the preservation and the continuity of the same monarchy. I mean, if the entire system depended on the fact that it was a functional monarch that was able to to provide this enormous deterrent to attract more resources and wealth just because of the stability that he was able to provide. Of course, people wanted this monarchy to be there. In fact, that's how, again, the French turned out to be tendentially at the end of the Middle Ages, right? This is the thing. If you notice how even Castile, for example, was in a relatively similar way, was a militarized country that managed to somehow get the upper hand on this enormous plateau. And even if there were very powerful oligarchs within the kingdom, at the end of the day, it's exactly because they concentrated so much wealth in their hands that they tended to, through marriage and such estates, just to be content with their status and to eventually merging into the ruling dynasty, right? Because consider that when, for example, there are also many times of peace, right? Like the one of the 13th century in France, probably meant after the beginning, when again the Capetians are able to reconquer almost all the land from the Angevins. Well, it's obvious that if there is no crisis, the system internally, at least say locally, does not structure itself for defending itself from central authority or from some external reality. Explain myself better. If you are, I don't know, the Count of Blois, right, and this thing is gradually absorbed by the Capetians. You live in the French heartland. You're not close to any threat, right? You do not even need to think that you have to be a militarily active and autonomous thing, unless the country doesn't engulf itself into some problem. Which means that before that happens, the king will have gradually extended his prerogatives to control better throughout all this world territory. So in other words, the communities would have, this is a bit true like for the seigneurial system on average, they would have consensually entrusted their own defense to somebody else. We have seen it just the other day in the video I made about how the French men-at-arms were actually recruited in the 13th century. There is the passage there exactly from this to the later system. That is to say, it was much easier. This is very typical also for the broader Middle Ages, to just pay money the king than having to serve militarily for him. And at that point, the king would hire his own mercenaries that were volunteers, and maybe there were even some parts of this impoverished aristocracy that thus was not acting as a feudal state anymore, but rather as just as, say, a gradually demilitarized area. And this is not to say, as Machiavelli was saying, in fact, that was noticing that France would have been easier to conquer, right? Because still the nobility ruled as lords in these lands, so it was very difficult for a foreigner to make way through that. But that happened also because there was a greater sense of what it meant to be a French, thanks to this sort of, okay, we identify also with the monarchy as our country, right? And the same monarchy would have built and manned castles, fortifications within the same France, right? You had pretty big states within the states, such as the Bourbon. Think about that during the Italian wars. It was threatening the same Valois-Angoulême. So you could have, for whichever dynastic reason, pockets of this, say, opposition to the monarchy. Again, it was not a fully centralized system. This is something that doesn't exist until Napoleon, as a matter of fact. But it's obvious that the country had come a long way from that sort of, I reason as if I am a paranoid ruler surrounded by enemies, right? And having to struggle for the top to, okay, there is somebody who takes care of the matter. I will simply do something else and will keep supplying the system, let's say, working, etc. and the state will think about how to create a very powerful military that is able to keep me out of trouble. Naturally, this again is on the very long term, but nevertheless, tendentially is what really happens at this point. So this is a reason why, also from a biological dynastic point of view, it's easier for a dynasty to survive, because you're really floating on the certainty that this system cannot quite be unhinged that easily, right? And that even when there are problems like the Jacquerie and other issues coming from the bottom, say, after the nobility, well, as we've seen, the peasantry doesn't know what to do. They can rebel, but they're not a state, they're not noblemen to know how to handle such enormous amount of people and land that make war professionally on a regular basis. You don't have central institutions. You can't quite easily storm. You don't have armies practically to storm castles where the wealth is stored, etc. So it's again a system that has a very effective way to self-preserve itself from a very long time. I mean, if you look at, again, we think of the fall of the Carolingian Empire as the end of a disastrous moment, but again, it's just the same system surviving and fighting against one another, and with not a radically large amount of weakening, right? Except for the fact that it's politically divided, so that makes it weaker in relative terms. But also the second invaders, the Vikings, the Magyars, the Saracens, are not really, they can't unhinge the system. Actually, it's throughout that time that the system actually starts growing back again, putting an end to those invasions, but especially establishing a greater continuity. And you can appreciate, for example, in Carolingian times, how much logistical infrastructure existed all across the empire, right? The fodder, for the horses was collected. There were so many stations. There was all a system of everybody knew what to do. Like the monarchy was already essentially dictating the order. The elite was in charge everywhere. So this was already profiling that sense of, okay, we can become ever more powerful if we continue like this from the bottom up. Right? As long as, at least in that case, we can pour resources in, we can keep everybody satisfied. There is no state, but there is this base that allows later on for an entire feudal establishment to rise and to rule and to effectively command and and succeed in this regard. So it's all very it's something one must understand in a very long-term perspective, in understanding the actual mechanism of government. It's not much about the dynasty per se. That also was lucky at some point, right? There's no doubt, but that was at the top of a system that was already habituated to self-preserve itself, right? Differently from, in a dynastic sense, in a monarchic sense. It was not true for Germany. It was not true for Italy. It was not true for most lands in Europe, as a matter of fact, especially the earlier you go. In Germany, you have, again, all this. It's an elective monarchy, basically. In Italy, it's practically the same, and even less sort of feudally predisposed in a way. There are lots of different. Again, this early. Also, the fact that, as we were saying at the beginning, also speaking of the Franks and the Goths, Gaul was a land that hadn't gone through major destructions of the latifundium from late antiquity. So again, the Gallo-Roman continuity with the senatorial ecclesiastical system with the Frankish one is notorious. I mean, the same Pipinids Arnulfings take the name from the fact that one guy was the Count of Cologne, or he was the ancestor of the Carolingians, and the Arnulfings was the name of the episcopal family of Metz, when the bishop of Metz would give his daughter as opposed to the Carolingian. So that is the most exemplificative picture of how strongly aristocratic and large estates based, the entire Frankish world had been and remained, and why it was so powerful. Right, at least, again, also there, the Visigoths, for example, had a slightly less fortunate situation, and eventually were overrun by the Arabs. But let's say the Franks were, in that regard, a bit, say, at the frontier with the tribal world, so they periodically had to keep in shape with this sort of wars, but not being essentially threatened by anyone. From the other, they fought against one another through this rival, branches of the same family. But already they had the capacity of ruling over other peoples that had not been, during the migration era, had been exhausted demographically and had been Frankicized, let's say. Also, they are dynastic, and so they ruled on. Right, the Aquitanians, the Burgundians, the Alemanni, the Bavarians, the Thuringians, etc. So already at that point in Neustria you have florid, relatively, at least for what the early Middle Ages could be, with traffics with Anglo-Saxon England. This is technically a client state as well. You already have this strong connections with the papacy since Merovingian times, right? This sort of quasi-clientelar relation with Italy as well. And the Byzantines knew that. I mean, when Justinian, for example, reconquered the western half, just the coastal areas, but one of the major concerns was actually stemming the Franks. Eventually, the plague arrives and everything contracts, and there are the Islamic invasions, etc. But in the times of Charlemagne, when things reactivate, indeed, the most obvious objective for any French ruler whatsoever is to conquer Italy. There is no other point. I mean, that was the point also for the Germans, for everybody. You must conquer Italy and rule from Italy as a Roman emperor. That's the only purpose of any ruler, ever, right? And the French come close to that at some different points in here. I mean, literally, the Carolingians become the next Roman emperors. And France does not exist as in the modern sense, but even later, when you think about the Guelph axis, I mean, from the Channel to the Aegean Sea, you have the Angevins largely, with their Guelph allies, the maritime republics, etc. They control the Kingdom of Sicily. They control parts of Greece. They establish the Latin Empire. Actually, they conquer the French, the Venetians. They conquer Constantinople. So there is always a Ghibelline system that doesn't die out, that counters a bit this, and I made, again, lots of videos about this topic as well, but you can't quite fully say that anybody has ever gone so close like them to the greater conquest of everything. I mean, the Germans, yes, do this in the second half of the 12th century, but basically they don't think that's the only time, right? Already under Frederick II, there wasn't really an hegemonic capacity, also because paradoxically the emperor was ruling from Sicily, and Germany was gradually slipping through privatization. He's the same one with the Edictum in Favorem Principum that actually sanctions that, and after that, just again, the German national monarchy goes downhill. And the French are the only ones that remain. That's incredible, right? When the young Philip IV and the old Rudolf of Habsburg, who had Frederick II as his godfather at his baptism, just to make you understand, even the generational difference. The guy had been born into universalism. Philip IV was too soaked into that with the myth of his saint grandfather Louis IX, but it was also statalizing dramatically in the most secularized and modernized country, let's say, in perhaps maybe Italy was, but let's say as a state, as a unitary power, right? Definitely the French monarchy. In spite of all the mystique, the religiosity was that. And the two guys met on the frontier between France and Germany, and it's quite fascinating. I mean, two worlds that really reflect. I mean, of course, the King of France being disproportionately more powerful than anything that the King of the Romans at that point was, as Rudolf of Habsburg. And so, again, that speaks volume about how, even by insurance, you would have to bet on the monarchy and somehow support it. This is something that goes on, in fact, much later, also during the modern age, basically. You have the same dynamic. France manages to make it through the confessional wars, the Fronde, etc. And But anyway, I think these two videos were fairly exhaustive. There's two answers actually. It's the same video, but I like this topic, and I always talk gladly about it. For today, then I stop it here. If you're interested in making more questions, etc., then please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel. Leave, in fact, a comment on your own question. For today, I stop it here. And as always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.